The thesis we chose to explore in our project was, the prison camps of the Civil War brought atrocious conditions to prisoners by the lack of supplies, acceptable system, and sanitation, which caused prisoners from both sides to become malnourished, anarchic, and diseased. After these conditions were laid out, the U.S. government made improvements on America's imprisonment system and rationale to emphasize the morality of the U.S. As the Civil War picked up its ferocity during the spring of 1864, thousands of captured soldiers laid down their weapons and were forced to march deep into enemy territory to inhabit already heavily congested prison camps. According to the Record and Pension Office, nearly 400,000 soldiers were imprisoned during the course of the Civil War. Of those 400,000, nearly 60,000, or 15% of them, perished in captivity. It is important to understand that although the Union was much better prepared for the war, both sides were not expecting it to be very long-lasting. This meant that they had not prepared adequately for the amount of prisoners they would eventually have to handle. Old warehouses, barns, training facilities, and federal institutions were all hastily converted into unlivable prison camps.
Even the battle-hardened veterans were ill-prepared for the horrors they saw at Andersonville, a Confederate prison camp, and Elmira, a Union prison camp. Initially, the goal of these prison camps was to hold prisoners of war that would end up being traded to the enemy for their own prisoners in return. However, when the Confederate President Davis refused to return black Northern soldiers and instead enslaved them, President Lincoln halted the exchange of prisoners. This led to the prisons to become more crowded than they originally were. Today, we will explore how the shortages of supplies, lack of cleanliness inside the camps, and the absent prison authority lead to disastrous conditions for the prisoners. We will also look into the effects and change that these camps had on the United States after the war.
In the South, the shaky and unorganized government left the army underfunded. They were struggling to supply their own soldiers with food, medicine, and weapons. Having the Union prisoners supplied was the least of their concerns. On the other hand, even the Union was not ready to put their dissipating resources toward having the Southern prisoners supplied. The Elmira prison, a Union prison located in Elmira, New York, is a glaring example of how the lack of supplies can affect a prisoner. We had the privilege of talking to Private Joseph Adams of the 50th Confederate Regiment, a man who survived the horrid conditions of this camp.
So, Private Adams, what did you have to eat during your time at Elmira prison?
We had to eat salted pork, cornmeal. Well, all I can say is we didn't have any vegetables, which does a toll on your health after a while. Even worse so is as food shortages became a problem, we began to rely on rats.
Wait, you ate rats?
Yes, we did eat rats. They would charge us 5 cents after a guard dog would pick them up for us. They were decent sources of protein, but 5 cents was a luxury most of us didn't have.
I understand. And what kind of diseases did you witness?
Typhoid, pneumonia, smallpox. They ran rampant. Alongside the inadequate medical care, 25% of us had perished by the time this war had ended. Because of that, we ended up calling Elmira hell.
As you can tell from Mr. Adams' interview, even in the North, the undersupplied prisons was a major problem.
There were similar problems in the Andersonville prison of the South. In Andersonville, the prisoners quickly realized that there were glaring shortages of food and water. The standard daily food ration was 1/4 pound of cornmeal and either 1/3 pound of bacon or 1 pound of beef, close to nothing for a fully grown man. These portions also came uncooked, meaning the men had to cook for themselves. This was particularly difficult because there was a shortage of firewood at the camps. If prisoners were lucky enough to have any money at all, the prices of eggs, bacon, and molasses were outrageous. You can buy an egg for 50 cents or $15 a piece in today's money.
The prisons also lacked sanitation. Diseases were common in the prison camps, which included smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, cholera, and typhoid. Furthermore, other diseases like scurvy and anemia were caused by the lack of fresh vegetables and fruits inside the prison. The place the prisoners stayed indoors were also crowded, which resulted in people sleeping outside even during inclement weather. The prisoners who slept outside were left with minimal clothing and blankets. To add, contaminated food and water combined with abysmal nutrition led to many diseases, which led to the increase in the mortality rate. Due to the severe diseases people had to deal with, hospitals were asked to play a big role in the recovery stage for prisoners, but these hospitals in the prison camps were in poor conditions. Those who came to the prison sick or injured were not treated. Many of them couldn't survive because of the poor conditions of the hospital. There also wasn't any acceptable system in the prisons. When the Civil War prison camps were first established, no specific laws or rules were carried out except for the fact that the prisoners should be humanely treated on both sides. There were so many people inside these prison camps that it was very overwhelming for Union and CSA leaders to keep their prisoners in check, which led to the lack of supervision. The Union and the Confederacy have only seen hundreds of prisoners being held, but in the Civil War there were thousands, and the people trying to keep the prisons in check could not handle the amount of prisoners being held, even with additional help. The exchanges between the Union and CSA prisoners were allowed until the CSA refused to treat the black prisoners as same as the white prisoners. One particular prison would be the one in Andersonville, formerly Fort Sumter in Georgia, the Confederates' largest and the worst prison in terms of conditions. Prisoners started coming in around 1864 when it was in the middle of construction.
The following clip is from an interview with Captain Jefferson Smith of the Union Army. Mr. Smith had served for the Union during the Civil War and was a prisoner at the Andersonville prison. Today, he is here to talk about the lawless raiders who inhabited this prison.
Mr. Smith, can you tell us a little bit about who the raiders were?
You see, although the guards were primarily focused on keeping the prisoners in check and focusing on not letting them escape, they cared very little about what was coming inside the prison camps. So the raiders were a gang of hooligans who committed crimes ranging from petty theft to assault, and they would even commit murder in broad daylight. And without the regulators, things would have gotten seriously out of control and the raiders would have taken over.
Who are the regulators?
The regulators were a group of Union soldiers that decided enough was enough and decided to hunt down the lawless raiders. In the end, they were the ones acting as the police force. The guilty raiders were given punishments ranging from cleaning sewers to, in some cases, death by hanging.
Andersonville was poorly managed due to guards abusing the inmates in the prisons. There was poor planning of how they would take care of the prisoners, and black Union prisoners were treated more harshly than white prisoners because the Confederates refused to acknowledge the fact that black and white prisoners were equal. In addition, Andersonville was horrendously overcrowded due to it holding 3 times the intended 10,000 mean. In Andersonville or Camp Sumter, they created a deadline. This was intended to prevent prisoners from climbing over the stockade or form tunneling under it. The deadline was marked simply by a rail fence. The guards would shoot any prisoners who crossed the fence or even reached over it. When one prisoner tried to cross the line to obtain fresher water than the water available on the downstream, he was shot. It was an excuse for the guards to shoot prisoners without reason. Combined with the lack of sanitation and overcrowding, Andersonville was one of the most heavily disease-ridden prison camps throughout the whole Civil War.
Though the Civil War was known for its huge casualties, the prison camp's conditions was also taken into account. The short-term impacts of the prisoners were some diseases that were able to be cured in short time. It also took time for the prisoners to be cured physically and mentally. Because the conditions of the prisoners were so bad, the prisoners also had mental issues that needed to be cured of. Another short impact was clearly the number of deaths just from the prison camps. The long-term impacts were that the U.S. was able to raise the movements in order to remedy the conditions of the prisons spurred after the Civil War. Another long-term impact was that this event was able to bring up new ideas for the systems of the prisons in the future. This brought interest to writers like Whitman and Dickinson to write stories about the conditions that the prisoners had to endure during the Civil War. From these stories, many people in the Reconstruction era were able to follow the sanitary improvements, staffing women, and many more were incorporated on this topic. One woman named Dorothea Dix took a huge part of the prison reform movement. She had many goals to establish, such as the main hospital system in the prisons. This system included the right treatment and medicine supply needed. Even though there are no prison camps in U.S. today, there has been much progress put into the rebuilding and establishment of hospitals to be clean and sanitary, along with the support of necessary supplies and many people on staff to assure that people are being kept healthy and treated with. In addition, most of the prisons today are now being supervised under clean environment. The prison camps from the Civil War has made a huge impact on the U.S.'s moral prison system.
Taking everything into account, the Civil War prisons were a rather distinctive and harsh punishment for soldiers to endure and cope with for an extended period of time. Many soldiers had to deal and live with the horrible aspects of pathogens, starvation, and stress from the poor sanitation, limited supplies, and subpar population control. In memoriam of the tens of thousands of men who suffered from the horrible prison camps of the Civil War, America took action into changing how prisons and hospitals are run and maintained. In today's world, these places are cleaner, better supplied, and better supervised than ever before.